My name is Eden Blake, and this is the part of my memory that I spent years trying not to revisit. It returns in fragments as if I am looking at it through a pane of glass that has been touched too many times. I stood in the hallway with a plastic bag holding my clothes because there were no suitcases left for me in the house anymore. The silence in the rooms felt unfamiliar, not calm, but the kind of quiet that comes only after everything has already been decided. My father stood with my sister while my mother held my brother's hand, leaving me a few steps behind with the slow realization that there was no hand reaching for mine. There were no raised voices and no final pleas to stay together. They simply selected the parts of the family they wanted to carry forward. And when their eyes passed over me without pausing, I understood they had already accepted my absence. I asked once, barely louder than a breath, "Where am I supposed to go?" The question disappeared into the air without an answer. 10 years later, when I had built a life that held its own worth, they returned. But I was no longer the child who once waited to be chosen. If you have ever felt like the one who was left behind, write just one phrase in the comments: "I am here." You do not need to explain. I will understand. 10 years ago, our house felt like it was holding its breath. The quiet was not peaceful. It was the kind that arrives when people have already made decisions they are afraid to say out loud. I could sense something shifting long before anyone spoke of it. The conversations between my parents had become clipped and careful. Their voices lowered not out of tenderness, but because raising them would make the cracks undeniable. They moved around each other as though the space between them had become fragile, and touching the wrong memory might cause the whole structure of our family to collapse. Meals were eaten in silence. Chairs scraped the floor loudly in rooms that once felt warm. My sister Lily stayed in her own world, building perfect grades and neat routines, while my brother Noah tried to fill conversations with the same humor he always used, though his laugh now sounded like something practiced rather than felt. I watched everything closely, trying to understand where I fit inside this unraveling pattern. One afternoon, my parents called us to the dining room. The table was set, but no one intended to eat. Lily, Noah, and I sat next to one another. My mom and dad sat across from us, leaving a distance that was no longer just physical. My dad cleared his throat before speaking, and in that moment I already knew what was coming. They said they were divorcing. No raised voices, no accusations. Just the slow, deliberate dismantling of the family we had been. What followed did not feel like a conversation. It was a distribution. My dad announced that Lily would go with him because she was structured and would adjust more smoothly. My mother placed her hand gently on Noah's shoulder and said, "Boys his age needed their mother's guidance." They spoke as though their explanations were rational, fair, even thoughtful. They did not look in my direction. My name was not part of the plan. I felt myself becoming invisible in real time, as if the space I occupied had quietly dissolved and no one noticed. No one asked me where I wanted to go. The decision had been made without requiring my voice. I sat still, numb rather than devastated. It was not that they chose my siblings. It was that they did not choose me. When I went to pack, the suitcases were already taken. I opened my closet and reached for what I could carry. My hand landed on a plastic trash bag. As I placed my clothes inside, the crinkling sound echoed sharply in the quiet room. It was a sound I have never forgotten, one that felt uncomfortably close to something being discarded. I folded my favorite sweater and laid it carefully inside the bag, as if the care I put into that motion could somehow prove that I was still worth keeping. The next day, a social worker arrived. She spoke gently, explaining that I would be placed with a temporary family in Fort Collins. Her kindness felt like it belonged in another world. My parents stood behind her, still and silent, as though their absence had begun before I even left. Lily's eyes flickered briefly toward me, searching for something she did not say, while Noah stood frozen, his hands curled into fists at his sides. I walked out of the house carrying the bag. The hallway felt longer than it ever had before, and the sunlight outside looked unfamiliar. I did not look back, not because I was brave, but because there was nothing behind me that was mine anymore. I was the only one no one kept. The first year in Fort Collins was the year I learned the meaning of the word home all over again. When I arrived, I carried everything I owned in a single plastic bag. I stepped out of the car with the quiet hesitation of someone who had been told one too many times that they were temporary. The house I approached belonged to my foster father, Thomas Reynolds, and his wife, my foster mother, Julia. They stood on the porch together, not moving toward me too quickly, not forcing warmth, simply letting me come at my own pace. It felt unfamiliar, almost unsettling in its gentleness. Thomas offered to take my bag, and when I expected him to lead me down a hallway or point me toward a spare room, he simply said that dinner was almost ready. His voice did not carry the softness of pity, but something steadier. Julia told me they had made pasta because the social worker thought I liked it, though she added that we could change the menu if that had been wrong. There was no expectation for me to respond right away. They were leaving room for me to exist without pressure, and that small allowance alone felt larger than any welcome I had known. The dining room was filled with small touches of a family who had lived life without excess, a bookshelf with worn edges, photographs taken outdoors not staged, a vase of flowers that looked as though someone picked them by hand rather than purchased them for display. When we sat down to eat, no one pretended that we were already connected. They asked simple questions, the kind that acknowledged my presence without demanding vulnerability. I answered with care, waiting to see if I was being tested. They did not push for details about where I came from or why I was there. They only asked what I liked to read and whether I preferred tea or cocoa in the evenings. In the quiet after dinner, Thomas picked up my coat to hang it. I expected him to place it on a separate hook somewhere near the door, clearly marked as belonging to a guest. Instead, he placed it directly between his coat and Julia's. It was such a simple motion that it could have gone unnoticed, but to me, it did not. I had spent years learning to read silence and gestures more closely than words. That one told me that I was not being kept on the outside. At night, I lay in the room they had prepared for me. The bedspread smelled like laundry soap and sunlight. The lamp on the nightstand was low and warm. I did not cry, though I felt something just as overwhelming as sadness. It was the fear of wanting to belong, the fear of reaching toward something that could disappear. Days became weeks in small, consistent rhythms. Julia would pack my lunch and leave a note inside that never said anything dramatic, only things like good luck on your quiz or the weather might be cold later. Thomas would wait for me in the living room when I came home from school, reading the newspaper, not asking questions until I spoke first. Their patience did not demand closeness. Their care did not arrive with conditions. Slowly, the distance I had placed around myself began to soften. I found myself sitting closer at the dinner table, laughing quietly at a joke Thomas made, or asking Julia how to make the pasta sauce she cooked every Thursday. It was not a sudden transformation. It was a gradual settling into a life that did not require me to perform in order to be accepted. One evening, I noticed my coat hanging among theirs again. This time, I did not feel like observing it from afar. I reached out and adjusted it slightly, the smallest acknowledgement that I had a place there. That was the year I began to believe I could stay. Those high school years moved slowly yet left deep marks within me. I entered freshman year carrying the same quiet tension I had carried since childhood, as though any kindness might disappear if I reached for it. Thomas drove me to school on the first day, keeping the conversation simple. He did not hover or pry. He simply let his presence sit beside me like something steady and reliable. Julia prepared a packed lunch that morning, placing it on the counter without commentary. There was no grand announcement that I belonged, but the care was unmistakable, shaped into daily details rather than dramatic gestures. Homework became an unexpected bridge between us. Thomas noticed that I often worked late into the night, erasing lines of algebra over and over, convinced that one mistake meant I was failing at life. One Wednesday afternoon, he suggested we go to the public library together. It was quiet there in a comforting way, filled with gentle page turning and the soft hum of air conditioning. He guided me through math problems with the patience of someone who did not see struggle as a flaw. When I hesitated before answering, he allowed silence to exist without judgment. That silence taught me more than equations ever could. It taught me I did not need to earn the right to take up space. Julia helped me in a different way. She had a gift for words and a deep respect for the thoughts I found difficult to say aloud. When I needed to write essays for English class, she sat beside me at the kitchen table and asked questions that made my thinking clearer. She did not correct me directly or write sentences for me. She simply helped me find the confidence to speak in my own voice. I began to understand that expression could be gentle instead of forced, and that clarity did not require raising my voice or proving myself. I remember looking at her hands once and realizing she moved as though nothing in the world needed to be rushed if it was meant to last. During sophomore year, I formed a friendship with a girl named Mara. She was thoughtful and observant in a way that felt familiar. We did not talk about families or pasts. Our shared silence was its own form of understanding. She sat beside me at lunch and never asked why I looked away when laughter grew too loud. She simply stayed. The friendship did not need to be intense or dramatic. It mattered because it felt safe. The school counselor, Ms. Harper, met with each student once a semester. When my turn came, I expected a scripted conversation. Instead, she asked one question that unsettled me. "When do you feel most like yourself?" I did not know how to answer. I realized I had spent years shaping myself around other people's choices. That question stayed with me long after the meeting ended, quietly challenging everything I believed about who I was allowed to be. Gradually, I began to release the belief that love was conditional or temporary. The Reynolds household did not change overnight in my mind. Trust took time to rebuild. Yet I found myself reaching for the warmth offered to me rather than bracing for its departure. I hung my coat next to theirs in the entryway without thinking. I caught myself humming while washing dishes. I laughed once loudly and without apology, surprising even myself. I started to understand that I was not merely surviving anymore. I was growing. I was learning that I did not have to earn love through perfection, silence, or sacrifice. I could simply exist and still be worthy of affection. And that realization was the first real step toward becoming the person I would later become. When I was 16, something within me shifted in a way that felt quiet at first, almost unnoticeable, yet undeniable once I recognized it. It was not a single moment or a dramatic declaration. It was a slow and steady settling of my heart into a place that had long been offered to me, but that I had been afraid to claim. Life in the Reynolds household had become routine, and routine had become comfort. I no longer waited for the unexpected knock on the door or the sudden announcement that plans had changed. I understood perhaps for the first time that stability was not a temporary kindness, but an ongoing choice made each day by someone who wanted me there. It happened one afternoon at school, a moment that could have passed without meaning if not for how deeply it reached me. I was talking to a classmate about an upcoming project meeting, and I heard myself say without hesitation, "I have to go home first." The word came naturally without thought or correction. Home. I realized it only after the conversation ended and the sound of it lingered in my mind with a warmth I could not ignore. I had called the Reynolds house home as though it had always been true. Around that time, Julia prepared a small birthday dinner for me. It was not extravagant or crowded. There were no streamers or loud surprises, only a carefully cooked meal and a simple cake with frosting that tasted like vanilla and something gentler I could not name. She placed one candle at the center not to mark age, but intention. Thomas sat with us, his presence steady and warm, and the three of us spoke as though we had always been a family. I felt seen in a way I had spent years trying to earn. No performance, no comparison, no conditions. Later that evening, Thomas handed me a small key on a silver ring. There was no speech to accompany the gesture. He simply placed it in my hand, his expression calm but meaningful, and said only that everyone who lived in the house should be able to come and go freely. The simplicity of it made the moment more powerful. He trusted me. I belonged. I was not a temporary guest waiting for a reason to leave. I held the key for a long time before slipping it into my pocket, letting the metal remind me of what I had been given. There was another change I noticed slowly. I no longer kept a bag of clothing hidden under my bed, prepared for the possibility that I would need to leave without warning. For years, that bag had been my shield, a quiet acknowledgement that love might not stay. One morning, I realized I had unpacked it without even thinking. The clothes were folded in my drawers. My belongings were placed on shelves. My life was not waiting to be packed up again. This was the year I learned that belonging is not something someone hands you. It is something you allow yourself to feel. I began to understand that love can be steady, patient, and present even when it is not dramatic. I began to believe that I was not living borrowed time, but rather time that was mine to grow within. When I turned 18, I chose to stand on my own feet. The decision did not come from rebellion or a desire to distance myself from Thomas and Julia. It came from a quiet understanding that independence was not a rejection of love, but a continuation of the trust they had taught me to believe in. I enrolled in the community college in Fort Collins and chose to study youth support services, a field that felt close to my history and the pieces of myself that had once been fragile and uncertain. I wanted to help young people who had lived through the feeling of being alone, seen only as a responsibility or an afterthought. I wanted to become the person I once needed. To support myself, I took a part-time job at a small coffee shop near campus. The work was not glamorous, but it taught me the rhythm of long days and patient earnings. I woke early, steamed milk, wiped down tables, and learned the subtle ways strangers reveal their stories without speaking them directly. In the afternoons, I volunteered at a community youth center, helping organize after-school programs and mentoring students who reminded me of the person I used to be. Those hours mattered to me more than any paycheck because they felt purposeful rather than necessary. Julia wrote the letter that helped me earn a local scholarship during my second semester. She did not tell me she was writing it. I only learned of it when the award notice arrived in the mail with my name typed cleanly across the envelope. The committee praised my resilience, commitment to service, and personal growth. When I read the letter she had written, her words held no trace of pity. Instead, they reflected belief, respect, and pride. I cried quietly in my room that evening, not out of sadness, but because I finally understood what it meant to have someone stand behind you without asking for anything in return. As my coursework continued, I began working part-time at the youth center as a program assistant, and eventually, after completing my certification, I became a program coordinator. I helped guide teenagers through difficult transitions, offering them tools I had once struggled to find on my own. I learned to listen without assuming. I learned to speak without lecturing. I learned that healing does not happen in dramatic breakthroughs, but in steady, repeated acts of being seen and understood. Financial independence came slowly but surely. I paid my own rent for a small studio apartment not far from the Reynolds home, though I visited them often. I covered my textbooks, my groceries, and my bus fare. Each receipt felt like proof of capability rather than burden. Thomas and Julia never interfered or insisted that I move back in. They simply remained present, ready to support if I faltered, yet confident that I would not collapse under the weight of my own steps. The most meaningful realization of that time was recognizing that independence did not erase belonging. I did not have to choose between being strong and being loved. I could be both. The home I built for myself was shaped by the foundation they had given me, and the work I did each day was my way of passing forward the quiet steadiness that had once saved me. I was no longer living to prove my worth. I was living to grow into it. 10 years passed faster than I expected. The pace of life had settled into a steady rhythm by then. I worked daily with young people who carried their own quiet storms, and my apartment had become a testament to the independence I had once only imagined. I did not think often about the family I came from, not because I avoided the memories, but because they no longer shaped the direction of my days. They were simply a closed chapter. Or at least, I believed it was closed. My father was the first to reappear in my life. I learned from a distant relative that he had lost his job after the company he worked for downsized. My sister Lily had moved back in with him to help manage the house, but their relationship had frayed under the pressure of Bill's strained tempers and the long-standing belief that someone else should fix things. One afternoon, I received a message from an unfamiliar number. It was his. He asked if we could meet. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the years of silence, only a request spoken plainly as though we had never parted. He needed help covering his mortgage. I read the message several times, not out of shock, but out of recognition. He was speaking to me in the same way he had once looked past me. I sent a simple reply declining firmly. There was nothing more to add. My mother appeared not long after. Her marriage had ended, and my brother Noah had accumulated debts that weighed on both of them. They asked to meet at a cafe near my work. I agreed, not out of obligation, but out of closure. When I walked in, they were already seated. My mother looked older, not just in the lines that shaped her face, but in the heaviness of her posture. Noah avoided eye contact, shifting restlessly. They spoke around the subject before eventually arriving at it. They needed help. Again, the request came without reflection, without recognition of the past. It was as though I were a resource, not a person. For a moment, I observed my own reaction. I had expected anger or grief, but what came instead was clarity. I spoke calmly. I told them that I had built a life from the ground up, one that had not been handed to me. I told them that the Reynolds had been the ones who saw me, who stayed when things were difficult, who offered love and stability without asking for anything in return. And then I said the words that had lived inside me for years before I understood them fully. Family is not the place we come from. Family is the place that does not leave us behind. My mother cried. Noah finally looked at me, not in anger but in realization. There were no accusations in my voice, no desire to hurt them. I only stated the truth. I stood up, placed my coat over my arm, and told them that I hoped they would find their way the way I had found mine. But I would not be their solution. Not now. Not after everything. When I left the cafe, the air outside felt sharp and clean. I was not walking away from something. I was walking toward the life I had chosen, the one I had built, the one that had held me even when I feared it might not. The chapter did not reopen. It ended entirely and without regret. I did not return. The choice was final, not born from anger, but from understanding. Life continued to move forward, and each of us walked separate paths shaped by the decisions we made long ago. Lily found herself working long shifts in a small grocery store in our old neighborhood. The work was tiring, repetitive, and required patience she had never needed before. Her friends, who once admired her quiet confidence, drifted away when she no longer had the luxury of ease. She learned to budget every dollar, to wait for what she wanted, to consider the consequences of what she said. Responsibility came to her slowly, like a lesson written out by hand every day, and although she never reached out to me, I sometimes thought she had begun to understand what I had known early on, that self-sufficiency is learned only when there is no one left to lean on. Noah worked manual labor at a construction site to pay off his debts. His hands grew rough, his shoulders tired, and the nights felt longer than the mornings. He no longer had anyone who could step in with a solution or soften the weight he carried. I heard that he rarely spoke of the past, and when he did, he chose his words carefully. He learned that asking for help is not a guarantee that help will come, and that every decision made in desperation leaves a mark. My father lived alone in the house where everything began. The walls stayed quiet and meals were eaten in silence. He had time to think, and he had time to regret. I heard that he tried to speak of family as though it were something fragile, something he wished he had handled differently. By the time he understood that love requires presence, patience, and effort, it had already slipped through his hands. My mother carried a different kind of emptiness. Without a partner, without the closeness of her children, she faced herself. There was no noise to drown out the quiet. She had to live with the realization that the distance between us was not created by chance, but by choices. My life with the Reynolds continued with warmth, constancy, and ease. We shared dinners, quiet afternoons, and unspoken trust. I began to understand that family is built through commitment, not blood. Family is not the place we are born into. Family is the place that does not walk away. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this story. If something in my journey echoed in your own, you are welcome to share your thoughts below. Every person deserves a place to return to.